Yeah, it's like when people ask us, oh, which fast should I do? We have 8 different fasts. I'm like, well, it depends on what you're trying to do. And that's interesting because I hadn't really thought about the fact that if you're running, the same distance, the nutrition is going to change depending upon what you want to accomplish within that distance. Do you want to go fast or do you want to just slow and steady? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes. Dr. Mindy in the house. All right.
I appreciate that.
The carnivore diet.
Because of what we eat.
Honestly, you've really touched my heart.
So Fast Like a Girl, it's ready for pre-order now. I hope this book changes your life the way the information has changed hundreds of thousands of women that have applied it. From the bottom of my heart, enjoy and let's get healthy together.
Let me kind of give you just a little bit of a background of just our podcast and our community. So we are a group of people that I've got close to 400,000 across all our platforms, that one of the things we do is we fast together. So we do once a week or once a month, we do a 5-day fast of all different types. And we do it as a group once a month. And so one of the big questions that has come up is around fasting and exercise, high carb and exercise, low carb and exercise. And so these are things that we have continually talked about. And one of the reasons I want to bring you on is to talk about nutrition and just sports performance in general. But when Drew told me that what he was doing with that 100-miler, my first thought, honestly, was like, oh my God, that's going to kill your body. Like, why are you doing that? And when we dove deeper into it, he said, oh, you've got to talk to Zach Bitters, because Zach Bitters, he helped me through the whole nutritional piece of this. So hence the reason we are here right now, chatting with you, because I really want to hear more of your mindset and how you approach this like extreme long distance type activities, and how you look at it from a nutritional aspect, and how do you do it from an injury prevention aspect. And we haven't done a lot on my podcast around different types of exercise and how to tap in to accelerating human performance through just different strategies around HIIT training, strength training, endurance training. This is what I want to dive into.
Yeah, no, those are all great topics. I think we can get into the weeds a bit with some of them and kind of chat about what I've done and what I've helped other folks do within kind of the context of kind of the low carb type of a strategy. And I guess, like, generally speaking, when just to kind of go to like endurance training in general, like, I like to kind of frame things in a way that is going to be like, kind of like relate the goals no matter what. And the one thing that I find really interesting with some of the ultramarathon type stuff, especially since it just is, longer efforts out there, is like the goal for basically anybody, regardless what their diet is going to be on race day, is to defend muscle glycogen. So you can get to events that are really long, in which case muscle glycogen almost becomes a bit less of a factor, especially if you're really good at burning fat. Most folks who are training specifically for a race that's that long probably will be relatively good at burning fat regardless of their diet, just because, you're running long distances. So a lot of people, even on moderate to high carbohydrate diets, are sometimes doing longer runs without a lot of fuel before and during and things like that, just to kind of train their body that way. But ultimately, you're trying to get yourself in a position where at the end of the event, you have intact enough glycogen stores that you feel strong and you can finish strong.
Okay.
So there's, like, traditionally with endurance, it's been kind of moderate to high carb has been the message. And I think some of that is relative just to some of the more standard, more studied distances that tend to be in what we can talk about after, if you want, kind of these gray area intensities that just make things a little more complicated or a little less natural, I guess, to the human experiment, more or less. But either way, like, when you just try to extrapolate that forward in an ultramarathon, where we know a lot less about from a strict kind of research standpoint, you find a situation where a lot of times people are battling this need, essentially, if they're following kind of a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, to defend that muscle glycogen by eating a lot of that sort of stuff during the race itself.
During it, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you just get a wide range of experience with that. I mean, I've worked with folks who, like, if they have like 20 to 25 grams of like some sports engineered product. Like that's like the peak at what they can tolerate anymore. And they're going to start like having digestive issues and just really struggling. And then there's folks who can seemingly do 60, 90 grams an hour and just clip right along, and then everything in between. So if you're going to follow a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, you certainly need to be getting probably at least 50, but probably closer to 70 grams of carbohydrate per hour in these longer single day endurance events. Now, in order to defend muscle glycogen appropriately, within that context, a lot of times we see, like, I believe the most recent position paper was like 60% digestive issues or some sort of digestive situation. So if you choose that route, if you fall into the norm, you're basically a coin flip's chance of having a day where you don't feel like you're miserable from a digestive standpoint to, you know, everything from like mild stomach discomfort to stopping every half mile and puking, or, you know, having to use the bathroom multiple times at the end of the race and things like that. So that's kind of like the traditional approach with it. Then you get folks like myself, other folks in the sport too, like Jeff Browning, Mike McKnight, Jason Schlarb to a degree, starting to experiment with different ways to defend muscle glycogen. And one way to do that is to increase your fat oxidation rate to the degree where your body's just not tapping into as much of that muscle glycogen from those lower intensity efforts. So like a lot of times with like a 100-mile race, personally, I'm looking at what you'd call like you just underneath your aerobic threshold. So I'm certainly burning a blend of fats and carbohydrates during that, at that intensity, almost regardless of my diet, but I can really, really bring down the number from carbohydrates by manipulating my diet and things like that. So I'm defending my muscle glycogen via increasing my fat metabolization. So it's sparing some of that glycogen stuff. So I'm just going to deplete less of it at a similar intensity as someone who's following a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. So where it gets a little nuanced, I think, is like a lot of times I think people want to think all carbs or no carbs. And really there's, I think, a lot of middle ground with that in the context of performance specifically, where I don't necessarily want to fat adapt myself to the point where I am like, I kind of like spin it on its head and now all of a sudden can't tolerate any carbohydrate sources during the race. Because even in a pretty fat adapted state, which I would consider myself in, I think my last peak fat oxidation rate was at 1.56 grams per minute, which for folks who are interested, that's about 50% higher than the high range of a lot of the studies done before what we saw in the FASTER study in 2014. So like I can definitely defend a lot more muscle glycogen with just my day-to-day diet. But when I start putting intensities up to what I can like optimally train myself to, if I put in like a really, really good training block, I'm still going to be dipping into my muscle glycogen to a small degree, but a small degree over the course of an entire day or 12 hours is going to be enough to deplete it. Mm-hmm. So I still need to defend that with small amounts of carbohydrate during the day. If my goal is peak performance, it's just much lower. So for me, like the highest I usually take my carbohydrate intake during a race would be maybe like 40 grams per hour, which is going to be underneath even the lowest range of what they would recommend you to do if you're following a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. Mm-hmm. And then like, I've kind of got this dual defense system put up essentially where I have improved fat oxidation rates, but I also have small amounts of exogenous carbohydrates coming in, both serving me to defend that muscle glycogen. So since I've lowered my carbohydrate requirement during the race itself, I also lower that risk of any type of digestive issue. So
interesting.
Yeah. So I think like for me personally, I've done, gosh, I've lost count, but I think I've probably done somewhere in the neighborhood about 70 ultramarathons now. And the majority of them I've done in the context of a high fat, low carb diet. And you know, I've had stomach issues before. I mean, it's almost unavoidable to never have a stomach issue unless I guess you maybe don't eat anything, but then you're kind of compromising your upend potential a little bit when some of these longer full day type events. And, you know, for me, it's like, you know, I'll have a stomach issue every once in a while, but it's way below like the 50 to 60%. It's maybe at most 1 out of every 10 times or something like that at worst. And it's usually not something that completely derails my day. It's like, all right, I lost a little bit of time where I would have maybe been able to run, say 15, 20 minutes faster for that 100-mile race versus what I ended up running had I not had to stop and, you know, address some of that sort of stuff. But, that's kind of the name of the game, I guess, is muscle glycogen defense, and how you do it is a little more dependent on the individual and kind of what works for you. And then there's just so many other variables you can tie into that too, where, you know, I work with folks who just follow kind of standard traditional dietary stuff. And then they get into training and they switch their diet. And for them, it's just a lot easier for them to stick to a high fat, low carb diet. And, you know, they may lose 15 to 20 pounds, which is going to be a huge performance benefit in a sport where you're trying to move your body all day long. You know, as long as you don't go like too extreme with it and end up compromising what you'd call your power weight ratio, where now you're starting to lose power along with the weight and it's coming out to be a negative return on performance. But you know, you have to try really hard to get down to that in a lot of cases. So most people aren't fighting that battle, thankfully, but it is worth saying that because there are folks out there who do, and, you know, find themselves, you know, losing too much weight, and then they lose performance on that end of the spectrum too. But
yeah. And what we see in our resetters is we've got a lot of like, you know, 50-year-old athletes that maybe are running a half marathon, or they just want to stay in amazing shape. And they're still trying to get their mind like wrapped around not doing high carb, to like carb load before like a Spartan race or something like that. And we get them to teach them the ketogenic diet. We teach them variations of fasting and ketosis. And what is hard for people to wrap their head around is the fact that fat may be as good of a fuel source for athletic performance as a carbohydrate is. So would you agree? I mean, that's what I hear you saying, is that, yeah, you've got to keep the carb down, keep the fat up, and you're going to have more access to not depleting your glycogen stores. Is that how I'm interpreting what you're saying?
yeah, I think like this is where a lot of the context kind of weaves in to a degree. So if you take like that person you described, someone in kind of their around age 50, and they have like multiple life focuses, like they want to be healthy, they want to be happy, they want to enjoy their activities, they want everything to click, but, you know, they're not trying to make the Olympics, they're not trying to win the race, that sort of thing. That person, I think, like their dietary structure they're gonna have a lot of options, and they're probably best off working with what works for them in terms of kind of getting there from their typical nutrition plan. So what can they stick to? What can they make sustainable? When we look at just kind of the metabolization of fats versus carbohydrates, the advantage that fats have is it's super stable. So like, you know, even someone who's at the very front of the race, very lean, couldn't afford to lose an ounce, has enough body fat on them to power them through like a really long race. They're not going to like deplete that source. What they could deplete is the muscle glycogen. So like with the fat, its advantage is it's basically unexhaustible. The disadvantage of burning sugar, burning carbohydrates, is that it's an exhaustible source. So the advantage of a carbohydrate over a fat is it's going to metabolize a little quicker, and it's going to require less oxygen to do so. So if you get into these like kind of areas where, let's say you're like an elite marathon runner and you're trying to run like a low 2-hour marathon, that person is going to maybe need to like lean on carbohydrate a little more heavily, because the cost of burning fat is a higher oxygen expense. When you're looking at kind of like what is going to be the best like diet for someone, there's like kind of almost multiple contexts within everything. So first context is like, well, what is the population we're looking at? So we're looking at like front of the pack elite marathoners. We're looking at kind of middle of the pack folks focused on, you know, careers, family, life, health, all this other stuff, versus running like eking every last second out, maybe at the expense of their own health and longevity. And for folks, and then we're looking also at just like, what is the relative intensity of the event itself too? So if you are someone who is going to spend, say, 4 to 5 hours finishing a marathon, the relative intensity of a marathon for them is going to be lower than for someone running it in 2 hours. So then also we're looking at a different like fuel, or like even a different system of training almost, or system of racing intensity at that point. So I think that's where people oftentimes get confused, because, you know, a lot of times I think we see like people who are kind of just your everyday marathon runners wondering why they're doing quite well on a low carb, high fat diet, and they don't necessarily see the guys in the very front or the women in the very front of the sport like doing that same thing, because for them it was like a game changer. They may have lost weight, They may feel more energy, may more consistent energy. They may sleep better. All these things that you see, like anecdotally, people report when they have a dietary shift that happens to work for them. So I think like when you're looking at it from that lens at the individual level, it just makes things a lot more clear and a lot easier to kind of make tweaks here and there to kind of put a person in their best position to be successful given their context they have, because there's just tons of variables that don't cross over when you go from like a professional runner to someone who's running for health, fitness, fun, and all that other stuff, right down to kind of how they even structure their day, much less what they're eating.
Yeah, it's like when people ask us, oh, which fast should I do? We have 8 different fasts. I'm like, well, it depends on what you're trying to do. And that's interesting, because I hadn't really thought about the fact that if you're running, the same distance, the nutrition is going to change depending upon what you want to accomplish within that distance. Do you want to go fast or do you want to just slow and steady? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, exactly. And like to give you a bit of an example of that for even if you took me specifically, so now we're making it a little easier to look because we're not comparing 2 different individuals, we're comparing one individual. If I do like 100-miler on a very flat like track or something like that, I've run, typically like my best performance is 11 hours, 19 minutes. It's like my better performances are usually just under 12 hours, somewhere in that neighborhood. For someone else who's out there who's like more near the middle of the pack, it might take them 24 hours to do that event. So for them, they're doing a 24-hour, whereas I'm doing essentially a 12-hour, even though we're maybe going the same distance. Now, if you take me and just say, okay, Zach, now instead of you just running for 100 miles in that time frame, just see how far you can run in 24 hours. Now I'm more comparable to that person who's running 100 miles in 24 hours, even if I go almost twice as far as them. But then when you look at my dietary difference between those, you'll see a shift. So for that 100-miler, that's under 12 hours, I'm going to keep a little more carbohydrate around in my training and during my race itself. Now I move up to 24 hours where I bring that intensity down even further because I'm going to be out there twice as long. I need to kind of scale back on how fast I go. Now I open up a much bigger window to even leverage what you'd probably consider like a classic ketogenic diet, or even getting close to kind of a no carb type of diet. And I think that's where it gets really interesting when you get that intensity low enough where you can defend muscle glycogen just fine without even consuming any carbohydrate.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's go back to the 50-year-old person who because the other thing that I think is so interesting right now is we have people somewhere between 45 and 60 that are really wanting to push themselves to these extreme levels. And I think people, between all the different ways we can track our heart rate and heart rate variability and calories and all that we've gotten like this whole new culture of people that want to biohack their performance. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. So what I have found just for myself and within our group is that the first step for the average person is you're going to need to move away from this thinking of carb loading for any kind of performance. Let's use a marathon as an example. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would even maybe go a step further and say that I think the way that we see carb loading in modern times has been so skewed away from what it was originally intended that it's no longer even serving the individual who's on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, because really the idea of a carb load is so that you start the race with completely full carbohydrate stores, glycogen stores, topped off. Now, you can, if you actually taper for a race where you're kind of reducing the volume and intensity of your training, you probably don't have to change your eating habits at all for your glycogen stores to restock themselves in that time frame. So you're actually restocking them by removing the stimulus that would deplete them versus adding more into it. So now what we've done nowadays is people still taper. They don't train right up to race day, usually in the same way they would when they're kind of peaking and doing their hardest weeks in the training cycle. They're scaling back. So then by the time they get to carb load, they already have completely topped off muscle glycogen that they don't need to go and eat a whole nother meal of 1,000 calories of pasta and all that stuff to top that off. They're just going to potentially ruin the race the next day by introducing a huge volume of food that they're not used to eating at that frequency, at that timing and stuff like that. And that's probably part of the reason why we see a lot of these digestive issues in some of these longer efforts, or even the shorter ones. it's silly to call a marathon shorter, but relative to 100 miles, I guess it technically is.
For the rest of us, it's a long one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like even within like the general community who's following a more like standard diet or a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, they could probably benefit from relearning what an actual carbo load looks like. But then you get the population like that you referred to, for them, like it's less of an issue altogether because they're just not leaning as heavily on that to begin with.
Would they benefit from being in ketosis going into a race or a longer workout? Like, do ketones help in athletic performance?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about the actual like metabolization of the ketone. What we know is that like there is going to be probably a sweet spot for like your fat oxidation rates. So like there's going to be, you want to, like what they would call is kind of like a metabolic flexibility part where you are able to burn high enough amounts of fat that you're not too dependent on carbohydrates. But then depending on the intensity of the event, you may not want to be so far into ketosis that like you've all of a sudden now found yourself in a position where any type of exogenous carbohydrate source is going to be unusable to you. So it's kind of like removing that tool from the table. Unless you're in a position where like removing that tool from the table is a non-issue for you because you've decided, I feel way better following a strict ketogenic diet. I feel really good and my ketone bodies are super high. I sleep better. I recover better. My training's more consistent. I don't get injured as much. If you find yourself in that position, then you may say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice that tool of an exogenous carbohydrate because so many other things have improved when I take that out as a whole. But I would venture to believe with most people, like assuming they don't get some sort of like digestive issue from it, if they're doing like a marathon and they're trying to eke out like every last second, a little bit of carbohydrate could probably go a long way for somebody who's even someone like myself or someone who's even further pushed towards like a strict ketogenic diet on a day-to-day basis, could still maybe get a little bit of a benefit from that. I think where we may see some research come out in the next couple of years that I think will be really interesting is essentially just the timing of all of this. So like one of the mistakes that I've made in the past and some of the folks I've worked with have made in the past is you get to like the beginning of a race, like right before you start or the morning of your breakfast, you have a little bit of carbohydrate just because you're thinking, okay, I've got enough fat reserve. I don't really need to eat a lot of that in order to fuel the race. It's already there. I'm gonna have a little bit of carbohydrate just to make sure my glycogen stores are topped off going in. And when you do that, what you can do is you can kind of trigger a scenario where your body's gonna push a little more towards dipping into those muscle glycogen stores earlier on versus leveraging that overnight fast and avoiding the carbohydrate for breakfast before the race and waiting until you're say like 45 to 60 minutes into the event to start bringing in any if you are going to. Because at that point, you've kind of gotten that point where you're really churning through fat at a high rate. So an introduction of a small amount of carbohydrate, and I mean, I've worked with folks who it's really small. It's like 5 to 10 grams or something like that. And like, they can see a little bit of a kind of a metabolic flexibility or a dual fuel substrate interplay there. But again, that's going to be dependent on kind of what your goals are too. So, there's folks out there like I think the first one I always comes to my mind is Charles Washington, who he probably fits your demographic perfectly. I think Charles is probably right around 50, maybe in his upper 40s or somewhere around there. And he follows a zero carb diet, runs all sorts of marathons. He doesn't eat or drink during the marathon. And yeah, he's an interesting guy, and he's improved his times relative to what he's done historically and things like that. So I think he's just a good example of like, when we think of like working with at the individual level, you've got to consider guys like him and folks like him who, for whatever reason, the original template just wasn't gonna work for him, and so it's just bringing the context in, I think, is always important.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do a lot and preach a lot is going in and out of different states, different diets. So you like feast famine cycling is what we call it, where you're stimulating autophagy and then you're coming over here and stimulating mTOR to build muscle. So when I hear you say that you want to maintain your glycogen levels when you're in especially these longer races. And then I come over to like the theories of HIIT training, and I look at something like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Carol bike, that is like all about depleting your oxygen stores. So is there a way we can combine those two theories? Like if you go and deplete your oxygen stores and then the next day you turn around and you build them back up, is that going to help you in sports performance if you're going in and out of those states?
Yeah, and essentially, like even a moderate to high carbohydrate marathon runner is gonna kind of almost do that by default, where like you're gonna drive your muscle glycogen down to where it gets really low, and then what you do by that is you leverage your body to, or you encourage your body, I guess, to start burning higher rates of fat because of that absence of glycogen there. So when I talk about muscle glycogen defense, it's more specific to race day because that's where like performance kind of becomes the driver there.
Yeah.
Whereas on the day-to-day basis, most folks probably aren't walking around with topped off muscle glycogen in most cases, unless they have like a rest day and they eat a bunch of carbohydrate or something like that, then they maybe do. Or if they are working out at a very low intensity and allowing that to kind of take place over time. So I think that there's some benefits to doing that. I think there's like, you're gonna encourage your body to burn more fat in the presence of low muscle glycogen. It's just, that's maybe not something you'd want to do on a day where you're focusing primarily on performance because you're removing kind of a faster acting fuel source. But muscle glycogen just in general, it doesn't require carbohydrate to resynthesize. Like you can do that through fats and proteins. It's just going to be a little bit of a longer, more multi-stepped process.
Yeah.
So this is where I think it gets really interesting, because historically, like if I get in a big training block where my volume intensity is really high, so, I might be doing 15, 20 hours of training and having like speed workouts or some heavier weight training sessions multiple times a week. In that scenario, if I go no carbohydrate, I will run my glycogen store down because I'm just not going to it's not going to build up fast enough with just fats and proteins. So that's where in my training where I might come up off of a strict ketogenic diet and reintroduce a little more carbohydrate. And for your listeners' context, that's usually at the highest point of my training, maybe 20% of my dietary intake. And then like 60% would probably be about fat, about 20% more would be about protein as like an example. And that's going to be enough for me based on my higher fat oxidation rates to kind of stay on top of that enough to execute those workouts. At least that's how it's played out in the field for me. Whereas if I decided to go and pick that most intense workout I do, so maybe I'm going to go to the track and do 12 by 400 meters, which can be a pretty brutal workout. I can go into that workout following a strict ketogenic diet, say 50 grams or lower, and run as good of a workout there as I ever have, as long as I gave myself a few days where I'm not taxing myself at an intense level and giving myself time to kind of build up those muscle glycogen stores through like gluconeogenesis and other pathways. So sometimes again, we go back to context again, right? So like if I wanted to do that workout, say 3 times in 1 week, or do that workout in the morning and then do a heavy weight training session in the afternoon, and then the next morning get up and do another workout, that would be a scenario where I may not be able to lean on like gluconeogenesis to keep my muscle glycogen in stock. So some well-timed strategic carbohydrate at a relatively low level compared to what you're going to see in most scenarios is maybe advisable from a performance standpoint. But again, structuring those type of workouts I would actually say are ill-advised for someone who's just focusing on health and stuff like that and not thinking about trying to maximize their potential performance and that type of stuff. I think when you're starting to block workouts like that, you're trying to peak for a specific event versus, just being healthy, enjoying life, staying fit, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think on protein cycling and if you've done any research on it, because what we've seen, again, just across so many different people, is that when they go into these fasted states, and then they come out of a fasted state and they do protein cycling. I had seen some research showing that every 2 hours or every 3 hours, if you have 20 grams of protein, that throughout a day, that's the best way to stimulate mTOR and to improve muscle growth is what it was. And that the next day, if they do a protein cycling day after several days of depletion, the next day when they go to lift weights or they go to work out, we have a lot of Spartan racers. When they go in Spartan race, their performance is like at a whole nother level. Now, those aren't 100-mile ultra marathons, but what do you think of that as a protein cycling and going in and out of these states of deprivation and then building back up?
Oh, interesting. So like, are you saying like so like one day you would do like a fairly frequent protein feed, and then the following days you'd step away from that and maybe do like OMAD or something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So I think from how I understand it, I'd be interesting to see. I don't know a whole lot about kind of the cycling side of it. What I understand though, in terms of just like protein requirements as a whole, step one, the big mover is going to be making sure you get enough high quality protein, so bioavailable protein. So for me personally, like I focus on the highest bioavailable protein sources, which tend to be like animal product protein sources, dairy sources, and things like that. So getting enough of that, which is going to be somewhat individual to the person's size and their activity level. And that's going to be the big mover for muscle recovery and that sort of thing. Then a step further, it's going to potentially be a benefit, but it's going to be a much smaller step than that first one where you're getting just enough protein in. And that would be like what you described, where like every few hours you're taking, say, 20 to 30 grams of protein to stimulate that protein muscle synthesis. So like if you had like a really brutal workout and you're trying to recover from it, it's my understanding that one of the best ways to optimize that with protein would be to kind of have that 20 to 30 grams of protein every like 3 or 4 hours on schedule, so that you're tapping that muscle protein synthesis on more frequent intervals versus hitting it once, like with that OMAD style. I don't know anything about like what it would be like I don't know how much of a carryover effect I guess it is after that first day of doing it. I do know like I don't think it's a huge advantage in terms of doing the frequent protein versus like an OMAD or a 2-a-day type of thing. But it in most people, it's going to be a small advantage. So I think usually the way I work with folks is like, first, let's focus on making sure you have a dietary pattern that's sustainable to you where you're getting enough protein in. Once we're there, then we can take that next step forward and start trying to space it out at the optimal time that you're going to need to, and then pair that up with the workout days where it's going to be most beneficial. So like mostly around like peak training phases where you're really putting your body through a lot more kind of stress and breakdown. But I'd have to look into that. It's interesting. I haven't, I do remember, I think it was, I don't know if you remember with the Mind Pump guys, they've got a pretty big podcast out in San Jose, and they were talking, this was years ago, so I'm not sure if they're still, if they've changed their view on this or not in recent years, but I know they had talked about protein cycling in the past where like, some of the research at the time was pointing to like, you can do like some protein sparing days and it actually can leverage a benefit from that. But I'd have to dig into that stuff a little more.
I'll send you the study because it was really interesting, because the number one complaint we get from people when they're fasting is muscle breakdown. So I started, and my feeling always was it's temporary. Like, of course, it's breaking down when you're in a fasted state. Your body's in a state of gluconeogenesis. There will be some breakdown that happens, but it's what you do afterwards that will determine how you come out of it. And then I started diving into protein, and I'm like, okay, well, let's look at protein. How about we have somebody go into these autophagy states where you're keeping protein under 20 grams. And then we put you into a state of mTOR. And I started off giving people just like 150 grams of protein in a day, and they could do it OMAD style. And then I saw an article that said you can stimulate mTOR more efficiently if you are doing protein every couple of hours. Well, the minute we shifted people over to that, we really saw, and it was primarily performance. We saw muscle growth because a lot of women that are 50, they don't want to lose a lot of muscle. And we really started to see people regain their muscle again. So I'll send you the article, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I know it seems to be kind of a bit of a debate in terms of kind of protein in general, right now, but a lot of I've been fortunate to talk to guys like Stuart Phillips, Professor Jose Antonio, Professor Don Lehman, some of these guys who are kind of at the forefront of protein metabolism and that sort of stuff. And the way they described it, I believe it was Don Lehman talks about protein usage with even your skeleton and your bone and things like that. Whereas a lot of times I think people don't necessarily associate protein consumption with bone health and bone density and that sort of thing. And it very much is. So, even when you get into the world that I am, where it's like long distance endurance running, oftentimes people are like, they're fearful, probably illogically, about getting too bulky, because it's like you don't want to be carrying around more than you have to if you're running a long ways and that sort of thing. But in reality, if you're doing the type of training required for those type of events, you're not going to get bulky off of eating, enough and even over consuming protein. If anything, you're probably going to lean out, because it's just going to be a higher thermogenic effect from protein sources. It's likely going to be more satiating for most people. I think it's time to bust the myth especially for I think women, that protein should be scary because it's going to make you look big and strong like a power lifter or something like that.
Yeah. No, I'll send you the article, the research study, because it was really like fascinating. And then to go to our resetters and try this, and we saw people building muscle, is really cool. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on injuries? Because when I think like 100 miles, I'm like, all I can think is I'm going to have some massive injuries. And this was my question to Drew when he told me what you guys did, and he did ice baths after he went through one loop each time. How can we use nutrition, or how can we use biohacking? What can we do? It doesn't matter if we're running 100 miles or we want to do a Spartan race. How do we prevent injuries, especially as we're aging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I think the big movers here are going to be like in the training itself, working from where you're at. And this is is more difficult nowadays too, with like social media and stuff, because you have access to seeing what everyone else is up to, which can be incredibly motivating. I know sometimes if I know I should be ready for a workout and I need to get out there and I'm just being lazy, I can like go on social media, go on the internet, I can see someone, maybe even my next competitor, like just really training hard. And also, okay, now I'm getting out there and going to go after it. So you can use that as an advantage. You have to be careful, because you have to always be working from where you're at. I like to call it kind of micro stressing. Our goal is to do like a micro stress, so it's going to be enough to get your body to make a physiological change to get stronger and more resilient. And then you can go a micro stress again, which might be a little bit more than time before, because you've adapted. And if you just keep doing that consistently over time, you eventually get to where you want to be from a training volume and training intensity standpoint. I think a lot of injuries and stuff are just due to people maybe getting overzealous early on because they're excited. They've got this new training plan. They've got this goal. I want to be here at this time frame. And then they just get out the gate a little too fast. The other piece of the puzzle, I think, is definitely nutrition. And we kind of touched on that a little bit with protein, I think. I think everything from bone issues to, like poor recovery times and things are oftentimes, could be associated with underconsumption of protein, alongside training too hard and all that stuff. So having that figured out, and then having like just a dietary pattern that works for you. So, if that happens to be something in the low carb, high fat category, then I think that's great. And it's definitely something that it is a good tool for you if it works. And there hasn't been any research that I'm aware of from a recovery standpoint on a ketogenic diet versus a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, other than there's a ton of anecdotes around, myself included, about when we moved from a moderate high carbohydrate diet to a low carb, high fat diet, there seems to be less soreness and less stiffness, less immobility, I guess is maybe the way to say it. The weird thing, after you run these 100 milers, it's like you get inflamed and sore, and it's hard to even bend your knees, much less do anything with them. Whereas from my experience and some of the other folks who have stuck with it, they tend to, after a big effort like that, feel like they have less of that soreness, less of that immobility and that sort of stuff. So if that turns out, and if that turns out to be the case, then you could make the argument, I suppose, that that improvement in recovery is going to allow you to train more, which the training more could maybe offset some of the potential deficits from leaning heavier on fat than carbohydrates from a timing standpoint or a speed of metabolization standpoint. Again, that's probably going to be dependent on the intensity and what the goals are from health and fitness to peak performance and all that stuff, and unique to the individual. But the other big one I think too is sleep. So, for me personally, when I was on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, and then I introduced ultramarathon training on top of it, my sleep started to get really bad. I'd wake up multiple times a night. And then when I left everything else the same in training, but switched to a low carb, high fat approach, my sleep went back to where it had been historically before it went bad. So for me, that was a big game changer personally, just because, I need to be able to sleep well and recover if I want to keep doing what I'm doing to make it sustainable.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. How often are you in ketosis? Do you try to stay in ketosis all the time? Are you pretty much on the ketogenic diet always?
Yeah, so I do, the way I kind of break it down is I'm basically always on a low carbohydrate diet where fat and protein are going to be like substantially higher than carbohydrates. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, there's parts of the training where I might flex up to around 20%, couple days a year, maybe if it's just like a really big block of training and I know I'm going to run a calorie deficit just due to the volume of training, I might flex up to like 30% for a few days. But that's about the highest it gets. And that's like in peak training. So that's in the context of like, say, 20 hours of training per week. And even when I did a really cool N of 1 experiment back in 2018 when I was training for a 100-miler. And I was testing my blood ketone levels about 3 times a day, 2 to 3. And just like periodically spread out. And I was doing it during my highest carbohydrate consumption within my program, which is going to be that kind of 20%, rarely, but sometimes up to 30%. And I was still in ketosis the majority of the time. I think I tested for, if I remember, I'd have to go back and look at my notes. I think it was like somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks. And within that 2 to 3 times, I dipped below 0.5 millimoles only like 2 or 3 times. But most of the time I was up between like 1 and 2.0 blood ketone levels. And some of those days I even had like 200 to 250 grams of carbohydrate. So like it's, context is everything with that too. Some of those days I was also burning 3 times my resting metabolic rate.
Yeah,
so
I was going to say you're metabolically fit is what I hear in that, that statement.
And what it comes down to too, it's like for me, if I want to stay in ketosis and I'm going to like work at my desk all day and not work out at all, I probably do need to be down near 50 grams, somewhere in that neighborhood. But when you add in that 30 miles of running and some mobility and a little bit of strength work, all of a sudden now I basically accelerated that 24-hour period to be more like 48 to 72 hours worth of energy demand in a sedentary state. So, the way Dr. Jeff Volek explained it to me was like, for someone like myself may need to look at 150 grams of carbohydrate the same way someone who's a little more sedentary, maybe going to the gym a few times a week, but mostly working at a desk would look at like 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrate, just lifestyle variances and things like that. So I do have phases of the year though, where I do go pretty strict, like 50 grams or less. And that's typically like off season time or early on in training where I'm focusing on just kind of gradually building lower intensity base and stuff. So there's just less energy demand and less intense stuff included in the plan.
Yeah, do you ever look at Carb Manager? We use that as to track macros. And one of the docs in my office is on the U.S. National Rugby team. And so she's been tracking on the keto diet her macros. And there's a place in that actual app that you can put in your exercise, and it will adjust your macros according to your energy output. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I've heard of some similar stuff like that though, but it is interesting, like some of these like app tools that you can get now. And even like continuous glucose monitors and stuff like that, where you can really figure out, like you can answer some questions where I think that it frustrated people, where it's like, well, why can that person eat a banana and not seem to have it affect them negatively? Well, when I eat it, I get like this like 10-minute burst of energy followed by like I need to take a nap type of a response. So some of these, like that type of stuff, I think is cool. And if you can build out over time and really recognize how certain exercises and workouts affect you and what your needs are within them, I think that's the sweet spot in individual programming.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts on exercise variation? Do you feel like you're running these 100-milers? Do you think if you want to achieve something really great with your athletic performance, you need to also add in some sprinting, maybe some yoga? Is that powerful or not necessary?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest, I think, misconceptions sometimes within the sport of ultramarathon or in the sport of endurance in general, is that it's always long and slow. There's this phases of my training where I'm doing basically all out sprints for 30 to 60 seconds. And there's phases of my training where my main focus is what I would call a short interval, like VO2 max type of a training session, where I'm going about as hard as I can for about 3 minutes, and then I'm taking about a 3-minute easy recovery jog, and then I'm going to do that again, and I might stack 5-6 reps like that in there. So it's very intense relative to maybe what I'm going to be doing on race day. So the way I like to call it is it's a periodized schedule, meaning I'm going to be focusing on different things during different periods of the training plan. I'm always working towards the most specific stuff I'm going to use on race day. So if that happens to be a 100-mile race where the intensity is much lower than, say, like a 5-kilometer race, I'm just going to be doing some of those short, fast, harder sessions earlier in the training plan. And then as I move closer to the race, I'm going to start reducing the intensity and raising the volume and just really working on the mechanics and the specificity that I'll use on the day of the race. So that's kind of how I look at it from the full scale. But I think there's a huge value in that stuff from just durability. When you think of just like the intensity I race at is a type of mechanic that is just conducive to getting hurt. It's very one-dimensional. It's
Right.
very overuse. It's like, if you just do that every day, all day, you're going to develop imbalances. You're going to have things that come about that are going to negatively impact your longevity and health, in my opinion. And a lot of them come to like a lot of hip, ankle issues, sometimes knee issues,
Yep.
tightness in those areas. So like mobility and strength, speed work, I help balance that stuff out quite a bit. So I always keep those in some capacity in my training.
Yeah, this was 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago. I played on a tennis scholarship at the University of Kansas, and this is when Serena Williams was just sort of coming out. And it was like my last year playing tennis, and everybody was so shocked because she was doing all these box jumps and weightlifting, and like she was the first person to bring cross training to our sport. Now a totally different sport than 100 miles. But it was so fascinating because then everything started to shift at that point. Everybody started going in and out of different training mechanisms. So, it makes perfect sense to me for injury prevention to not do the same thing over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah. And that carries over into the weight room too. You reminded me that when you said box jumps, because I think sometimes like another classic mistake endurance athletes will do is by the time they get around to getting into the gym, they're going over and they're picking up the 5 to 10 pound dumbbells and doing high repetition stuff, similar to what they're doing running. And it's like they're essentially doubling down on what they were already doing. So like the real move, I think, for endurance athletes is actually to focus on heavier weights, lower reps in most cases, but working within the context of where you're at, because it is a supplementary activity from what you're trying to do. So making sure heavy's relative. Heavy for me is going to be different than someone who's world-class deadlifters.
Right.
So
right.
For me, I like operating within rep ranges of 3 to 10, depending on where I'm at in the season, focusing on some of those core lifts like squats, deadlifts, box jumps, kettlebell swings, that sort of stuff, as a way to kind of keep myself durable, keep like the posterior chain nice and strong, so I don't become too dominant and balanced on other areas of my body that are going to be kind of pushed that way from running as much as I do.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you think women and men need to train differently?
To a degree, I think there's a lot of crossover in terms of just like what systems of training are going to benefit you more versus others. And I think that would carry over pretty consistently, but the timing of it, there's probably going to be the biggest difference. The big one is, women are figuring in, their hormone cycles and things like that. That's going to be different than men. So if you're familiar with Dr. Stacy Sims, she has actually done some pretty cool work on the timing of workouts for women versus men with endurance sport.
Oh, nice.
So she's brought to light a lot of the the misconceptions we've maybe had as to, like, her big thing is women are not small men. So it's like there's a time to do intensity stuff, and there's maybe a time to do other types of training when you're working in the context of your cycle if you're a woman. And obviously as men, we don't have to worry about that. So it can be maybe I guess maybe the way to put it, we can get away with more from a timing standpoint. So that's the interesting stuff. And I think if anything, what she's done with that is just put a little bit of an incentive on the glaring kind of weakness in the research, probably for women specific athletes. I think a lot of these studies we lean on are oftentimes not only focused on just elite athletes versus average athletes, but male athletes too, in like probably the relatively young, like 18 to 30-year-old demographics. So it's like, what about our women? What about our women and men who are middle-aged and that sort of stuff? It's like, I think there's a lot of growth in those areas in the research field, and where the nuances and the differences may be.
Yeah, we need a lot more studies separating them out. I don't know if you saw, there was a study that came out this week, and it was kind of a sensational headline that said intermittent fasting is not a tool for weight loss. And when I dove into the study, it was like 116 obese individuals, and they were men and women from the age of like 18 to 50. And I'm like, okay, this is not fair to look at how fasting relates to an 18-year-old man compared to a 45-year-old menopausal woman. Like we need to start to look at the times of life and the sexes based off of just hormonal changes alone. The 50-year-old man's not going to have necessarily as much testosterone per se as the 18-year-old man. So I do think these nuances are important when we're trying to biohack using nutrition and exercise and things like that. We need to be a little more careful at how we are interpreting the information. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think like with some of that stuff too, because I've seen some stuff like bone density in that sort of with some of the studies too. And I always feel like that, like maybe the message just needs to be like, like if you feel like you range differently from the study results, like there are like relatively accessible things you can do to know. Like you can go get a DEXA scan and see for yourself if you really need to know, am I losing bone density or gaining bone density? Am I creating muscle loss in areas I don't want to versus other areas and things like that too? So like, I know not everyone has that, so they maybe have to lean on some of that stuff sometimes, but I'm big about like working at the individual level versus the group level with this sort of stuff, because it just seems like I don't envy the researchers and the scientists in the community of like nutrition, because it is complex and there is only so much we know and have to base stuff off of. So it's like it's hard to get a message there is no message that's probably going to be universal. So when do we separate the individual from the group, I guess, is maybe the big question with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Now you have a really cool podcast. I went and started listening to some of them. You've had some really neat guests on. One of my takeaways when I was like looking at your podcast and what you're doing in the world, I was thinking, why has it become this 100-miler has become like the new fad, is the way I see it. Like people are craving to go to these longer distances. Have I just not been aware of this trend, or do you think that it's more popular than ever?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think like the 100-mile distance itself, I think is maybe a little more popular as like this big kind of like holy grail of ultramarathon in like North America. Partly because like there's ultramarathoning has gone through like several like kind of growth and retractive periods over like essentially last 100+ years. So the most recent kind of growth phase it got popularized with like a couple of books and some documentaries and things that really highlighted. And the 100-mile event was like kind of like front and center for that. So as like more people entered the sport, I think they entered it with this mindset of like 100 miles is the end goal. That's the one I want to really, find my way to, work towards, get there and execute. And specifically, there's a race called the Western States 100 out in California that has gotten really popular. And it's like if you try to get in as a first-year entrant, you have about a 2% chance of getting into the lottery. It's crazy. So. So yeah, I think there's some of that. but there's been just like a draw, I think, kind of like to the trails and to ultra marathons in general too. And like you go over to Europe and there's just a lot more of an emphasis on running a specific route versus a specific distance. So they've got like these really like kind of famous like routes, and sometimes they come out to be like an odd distance, like 106 miles or something like that. And they're more interested in kind of that versus, hitting an arbitrary number, I guess. But when you get on the road and that sort of stuff, which is a little bit of a slower growing side of the sport, the trails have definitely grown faster in this last kind of phase of ultra running. You get a little more kind of like distance specific, like 100 kilometer, 50 mile, 100 mile. And then you get the timed events, like how far can you run in 12 hours? How far can you run in 24 hours? And those go on forever. You get up to like 6 day, 10 day, and all sorts of craziness. So.
Yeah. Do you think the human body's meant to continually run that far?
I mean, it can. Can and should is probably the way to look at it, right?
Yep.
I think humans that in general are pretty like mechanically designed to cover long distances at a very slow rate. Just evident by our sweat. We've got assets to us that other mammals don't, in terms of being able to cool and run in a variety of different climates like successfully. So I think it's like we're definitely like set up as if that were like something that we were needing to be able to do maybe back before we had all the resources we do today. But there's always probably a margin of diminishing return with that too. And I think with running, where it gets kind of interesting is when you get into like these paces that are between like a really slow effort and a really, really fast effort. So like paces between like all out sprinting and anything from like a brisk walk to a real easy jog is where I think we start playing some weird physiological games maybe with our body. But then I think a lot of it's going to be like dosage and context too. So, folks who start slow and kind of build themselves up gradually can probably make it a more healthy lifestyle than say somebody who decides to jump in wholesale right out the gate and then does a little too much too soon and finds themselves in compromising their health in the process.
Yep.
But yeah, it's a good question.
I ran a marathon once, and that was the first thought I had when I got done. Now, of course, I didn't train properly, and this is like 25 years ago. And I was like, I got done, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure the human body wasn't supposed to go, 26.2 miles, let alone 100. But I've been in awe watching this trend of people doing these 100-milers. And it's so fascinating listening to you talk. And Drew and I kind of unwound what he had done for training. And I thought, God, yeah, no, that makes sense. Like if you get your body if you set it up right, it can do this. And, we see people in Africa that are running hundreds of miles barefoot. And, the body can do it. Was it meant to do it? I haven't quite figured that piece out yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think like marathon training, if you look at like a really good marathon training plan, that I find to be almost more maybe detrimental or more foreign to like what we're used to than even like 100 miles is a long way to run. Like I think humans traveled long distances like that likely over multiple days and at a lot slower rate with no huge incentive to like destroy themselves in the process. But like marathon running kind of fits right into that gray area that I was talking about before, where you're not going slow enough to make it very sustainable, but you're not going fast enough to get like the strength benefits from it, I guess. So you find yourself kind of trying to maximize your potential in this pacing strategy that's not really necessarily useful from like an evolutionary standpoint or from just like a human species standpoint. And that's where I get curious about just maybe what are the long-term ramifications from that and everything else.
Does the pacing change in 100 miles?
Yeah, you can like usually like this is maybe something that's still relatively debated, is that like, is it better to what they call like a negative split where you run like slightly faster as you get closer to the finish line versus a positive split where you kind of go out faster and then you're running slower near the end, or like an even split where you just try to run very consistent the whole way. Historically, I've had my better races probably running pretty even split. But there's other folks out there that, they really love going out a little faster than what they know they can sustain because they're feeling a little more mentally and physically fresh at that point. And then they're essentially like bagging some time for the end. But you're playing with fire a little bit going that way. I think it's probably a lot safer bet to negative or even split versus try to positive split a race like that.
Interesting. Have you heard of the term intermittent living?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so this is a new term that's sort of bubbling up, and it's basically that as humans, we're programmed for comfort right now. We can wake up in the morning, we can get to the refrigerator, we could eat all day if we want it, we could go to our thermostat in our house and make sure our temperature is exactly what we need. We can manipulate light so that when it's dark out, we can always turn on light. So there's, in this sense of comfort and manipulation, our mitochondria are not forced to grow and to adapt. And so intermittent living is taking these things that move us into discomfort and create like a hormetic effect where it forces those mitochondria to start to have to work more efficiently. It's almost like our mitochondria are lazy. And it's everything from fasting to the ketogenic diet to cold plunges to I interviewed a guy who believes in intermittent hypoxia, where you go into states of holding your breath. And then, of course, we have the cold showers. And then there's light, like people who believe in circadian rhythm, where you should only turn on light once light is outside. So I'm thinking about the 100-miler, and I'm like, well, it would be a force, a way of forcing the body into a different type of adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you probably just highlighted what's so incredible about the human body in general. It's almost like you try to outsmart it and it just outsmarts you sometimes. And I think it's like, it knows like, I need to adapt to what's coming at me, but if you don't bring something to it, it's not going to adapt to that. It's actually going to probably deprogram it. It's like, oh, I don't need that. Why would I keep it around? And I think you see that a lot in strength training too. It's like, it can take you a long time to build up that strength. And then like you step away from it a while, whether it's an injury or just you're stopping for whatever reason. And then it seems to go away really quick because your body soon forgets and says, nope, you don't need it. You're not trying it. So I think that is like exposing your body to a variety of different stimulus, I think is probably going to make you a more well-rounded, durable person as a whole.
Yeah, and if you're probably doing 100 miles, it might be time to try 200 miles then.
Yeah, that's actually there's a few 200-mile races or 200+ mile races in the US now. So it is, you saturate that, like, well, the funny thing with where I think ultramarathoning maybe differs a little bit from like the standard endurance distances is, people who become like really big fanatics of like the marathon, they're always targeting that same distance. So for them, it's like, how do I take that next couple minutes off? What do I do differently to hit that new benchmark? And that's their draw to come back, to improve their pace. Whereas with ultramarathoning, I think there's probably just as much incentive in like, all right, I just did a 50K for the first time. Now I want to do an 80K or a 50 mile. Now I want to do a 100-kilometer race. Now I want to do a 100-miler. And you get enough people in it that get to that 100-mile benchmark. And some of them are going to still be like, have an appetite to see, well, what's next? And then you get the 200-milers and the multi-day stuff. So it is kind of an interesting like draw to the sport, I suppose.
What happens to your mindset? Do you get to a point where your like mind tells you I can't go anymore? This is like, do you have mindset tricks you use?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely like probably one of the biggest hurdles to get over with these longer events is that mental side of things. Cause early on in the race, any like seeds of doubt that creep in, you can pretty easily kind of push to the side. But then as you get further into the race, though they tend to be more frequent, like you start drifting towards negative thoughts a lot easier. And like you might get past one, but the next one might come up a lot quicker. Whereas in the beginning, like you might push down that first negative thought at like mile 10 and you don't get another one until mile 25. Whereas like at mile 70, you might have a seed of doubt creep in and then, a mile later have another one creep in and stuff like that. So it just gets a little more fatiguing to keep like, pushing that back and trying to focus on staying positive and staying in the present. So there's a lot of tricks that I've done too, just in training, where like when I do my long runs in training, oftentimes I'm just pretending like I'm at that point in the race. So if it's like a 30-mile long run, I pretend I'm at 70 miles and 100-mile, and I'm just visualizing like how I would go through that. And you do that like 6, 7, 8 times in the kind of final phase of your training. By the time you get to that point in the race itself, you feel like you've done it enough that it's not so foreign to you that you're trying to pull from experiences from the last 100-miler, which may have been like half a year to a year or longer before. So there is a lot of that stuff. And the more of them you do, the more tricks you kind of pick up that work for you, and ways you can kind of recognize like when things are heading the wrong way mentally, and course correct a little better. And that's, I think, kind of the fun part about being in the sport as long as I have now, where you kind of, you got enough of those experiences that you can kind of lean on. And so now if I have a good race now, I think about like, oh yeah, I actually used what I learned in that race that went terrible for me in this race. And I don't know if I would have had a good race had that not happened. So you start to appreciate even some of the less desired days that you've had earlier in your career.
Yeah. And what about music? Do you listen to music at all?
Yeah, I'll do like a little bit. Sometimes it depends. Like some races are like sanctioned and they don't allow it, so then you're just left with your own thoughts. Others are a little more like open with that sort of stuff. So I'll usually use it interchangeably. So I don't. What I find is if I try listening to music like an entire long race like that, by the time I get to like the hard part of the race, I'm just no longer inspired by any of the music. So,
yeah, I bet.
So I try to like, I bring it in as needed. So if I'm feeling really good, I try to turn it off. And if I feel like I need a distraction, then I'll flip it on for a little bit.
What do you listen to?
I have just a variety of different stuff for the most part, but like I'll do like quite a bit of just like kind of classic rock for the most part. Something with a little bit of energy behind it.
Right. Yeah. Something with a good beat. That's awesome. Awesome. Well, let's finish up with this. I have 5 like specific questions for you just off of your own personal life. The first one is what's your favorite recovery strategy? So like you've done a big race. Next day, what's your favorite strategy to recover?
Yeah. So one thing I try to do if I can help it is give myself enough flexibility in those next few days to like sleep whenever I can. So sometimes the hard part is you run these 100-mile races and your hormones are so whacked out, adrenaline, all this other stuff. So that you might not even sleep well that next night. You might be pretty restless. So like then if I feel like tired and feel like I can take a nap in the middle of the day, that's like a great way to speed up that recovery if you can afford the time to be able to do that. So if I can help it, I try to give myself a little flexibility to be able to, as soon as I feel like taking a nap, just lay down and do that.
Awesome.
So I'll stay away from maybe caffeine during some of those days for the most part, just so I don't, try to push through that opportunity. This is the time of my recovery where I'll drop the carbs down to next to nothing. And sometimes I'll go 0 carb during those next few days after a big race. Other things I'm trying to think about is just kind of catching up on hydration, electrolytes, that sort of stuff. If I'm able to, I'll start doing some very light movements like easy walking, some stretching, some mobility type stuff. Nothing that would induce any type of training stimulus, but stuff that's just going to kind of get blood flow to the legs, that sort of stuff. I'll do like Epsom salt baths and things like that to just loosen things up a little bit. And, chances are like the magnesium is going to be welcomed after a long race like that. So those are some of the big ones, I think.
What about ice baths? You had Drew doing ice baths.
Yeah, so the ice baths for Drew were more of an intra-race hack, because for him what happened was he had to actually like kind of switch his event last minute with all the COVID stuff that happened. He was originally going to do it in this like really scenic area along the coast. And for that, the weather would have been perfect. He would have probably hadn't have to worry about overheating, things like that. But when that kind of got derailed with COVID, he had to pick I think it was a 5-mile loop near where he was living, which offered a lot hotter temperatures.
Yeah.
So he would do a loop and he would jump in that ice bath just to bring his core temperature down. Because what we've kind of learned is from cooling, you can cool yourself a lot better from topical cooling than you can from just like drinking cold beverages and stuff like that. So if you can, most people aren't going to have access to an ice tub like Drew did. So they're going to like dump ice water on their head. They might put like ice bandanas around their neck and things like that. But Drew had that set up so that he could just jump in after each lap, bring his core temp back down and head back out and avoid the overheating as much as possible. But for ice baths in general, I think this is an interesting topic for athletes, because what you're doing a lot of times with ice baths is you're kind of you're delaying the inflammation. You're delaying that swelling that's going to move in after a big workout. So I think there's a time and place for ice baths in the context of workouts. So one would be like you just did a big workout, but you have another one soon after, and you want to kind of like push back that stiffness and that inflammation that you might get from that first workout so you can go and execute that next one. But when you get to a point in your training where the primary focus becomes recovery, that's where you may want to step away from the ice baths for a little bit so that you can actually let that inflammation, because it's not chronic inflammation, it's actually just, it's needed. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you don't necessarily want to like shut that down with the ice baths too frequently when you're focusing primarily on recovery. So I'll stay away from them for the most part right after a race. But if you're, for example, I'm doing like a back-to-back long runs, a pretty popular workout with ultramarathon runners where typically it's done on the weekend. You'll do like, for me, a big one I did last year was 30 miles on Saturday and 30 miles again on Sunday. So in that context, after that 30 miler on Saturday, I might take the ice bath so that I'm pushing off that that stiffness a little bit until I do that 30 miler on Sunday. Then I'm going to have a couple days where I let everything catch up. So then I maybe step away from it a while and focus maybe more like an Epsom salt bath, stretching, mobility, and that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Okay, what's your favorite pre-race meal?
Pre-race meal, I'll typically do like the night before. I'll bring a little bit of carbohydrate back the night before since I'm not going to have any like the morning of for the most part. So I'll still do like traditional stuff that I do a lot, like a steak. But then I might have like a potato with it or something like that. I try not to get too crazy with fiber on the night before a race, just because it's especially undigestible fibers, this potential extra bathroom break that I don't really want in the middle of a performance and that sort of stuff. So I stay away from some of the non-starchy vegetables that I'd maybe have in my day-to-day stuff, like some broccoli, spinach, or something like that. But yeah, a lot of pretty basic at that point, meat and potatoes, I guess.
Yeah, I love it.
Cream or dairy.
I love it. Okay, what's your favorite gadget? I've been using an Oura Ring, and I just got a Whoop band, and
cool.
I know that the more you trick out your gadgets, sometimes it really helps increase your motivation. What's your favorite gadget for working out?
Yeah, I've been kind of similar to you. I've got a watch right now. It's called the Coros Apex that does a lot of the activity tracking as well as like the GPS function. So like if I do a run, it'll tell me like where my heart rate was at all the points, where my pacing was, elevation, gain and loss. So I can really tease out like where my effort was at given the context of the environment and all that stuff. And then it tracks like the sleep and all that stuff too. So you can definitely geek out and see a lot of stuff that are interesting. It's like, oh, well, I did that and then my sleep quality went down, or I did this and my sleep quality went up. And if you can see trends within that for yourself, you can really learn a lot about your own programming and things like that. But I'm actually going to be doing, hopefully starting on Monday, I'm going to do a little N of 1 experiment with a continuous glucose monitor. So
nice.
If you ask me in a month, I might have a new gadget that I'm interested in.
Oh, those are fun. I wore one once. They're really, really fun. So if you could, I know you do a lot of like nutritional coaching for athletes. If you could take any professional athlete right now and coach them nutritionally, or just coach them in general to better performance, who would you want to work with?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. I would definitely be somebody who has struggled with a kind of a conventional approach, because that's where I find it interesting. Like I think like folks who kind of take like the standard approach and have success with it, great for them. But like I'm not as interested from the curiosity standpoint. I'm kind of curious in the person who's like, well, they did everything right according to the research and things like that, but it's not working for them for whatever reason, and then try to tease that out. And that's where I have a lot of fun with my own coaching clients too, is figuring out their own fueling plan and stuff like that, especially on race day where I think there's some ranges there. But gosh, if I had to pick, I don't know if anyone really sticks out that's kind of fits that parameter at the moment. I'm sure there's plenty of them, but
the one I want to get the message of the ketogenic lifestyle too is Serena Williams. Because she keeps conking at like during that second, she comes out strong, wins the first set, conks in the second set, and then the third is like a crapshoot on the bigger matches. And I keep thinking, I wonder if she's doing the ketogenic diet. Like it almost looks like her fuel source is depleted. Now that's it's not an endurance race, it's a start-stop, but still nutrition is powerful.
That's actually a good point. I think like the interesting sports are like tennis or like mixed martial arts and some of these like types of wrestling, some of these ones where it's like, you're kind of in between like very explosive and like long and slow. Like someone like Serena, she has to be incredibly explosive for every one of those, every one of the volleys. Am I saying that right? For
Volleys,
tennis?
yep, to get up. Yep, you got it.
There we go. All right. I'm not as incompetent with tennis as I thought, I guess. So some of the volleys, but then she's also got to last like some of these matches are multiple hours long.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's that perfect blend. And I think that's where it gets really interesting with that, because she also has to probably focus on glycogen defense, but she has to do it in a slightly different context than me, because I'm going to be trying to stay pretty even pace, whereas she's going to be fast stop. So like, it would be interesting to see, first of all, I think what she's currently doing, and then where there would maybe be some areas to possibly address. But
yeah, no, I've thought about it a lot every time I watch her. Okay, last question. So if you had like one message for the world that you wish everybody could understand, maybe it's about ultramarathoning, maybe it's just about life in general, what would that message be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think because what I a lot of times see is folks do a great job of picking like, okay, this is where I want to be. This is my kind of end goal, which I think is great. But once you kind of have that, I think what people oftentimes miss is this opportunity to pick small wins along that path. So like if I'm training for a 100-miler in 4 months, that's a great long-term goal. But if I want to really have that be a great experience for me, I need to be picking things that I can count as wins or check marks on the daily basis, on the weekly basis, on the monthly basis. So even if I get to that race and not have a great day, I can look back on the experience and think, wow, I learned a lot, because I learned that when I do this, this happens. If I'm able to like motivate myself to, do this and check that off, it accelerates my motivation for the next thing in line. And I think, when people don't put those mini goals in there, then sometimes their interest starts to wane as they get into like the thick of the schedule, as that end goal isn't quite close enough to motivate them anymore.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's good for everybody on every level. So we're always looking at the end results. So this was awesome, Zach. I really appreciate you letting me pick your brain. Nutrition and working out keeps coming up in our community. And Drew was like, you were the guy that we needed to pick the mind of. So thank you so much for letting us do this. How do people find you?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me on. It's been a blast chatting. It's always fun to hear about what you're doing, the people you're working with, and what's working for them, and that sort of stuff. And so the best place to kind of find everything I'm up to is on my website at zachbitter.com. Then you can see all my social media links, consultations, contact me for coaching and things like that. But from a social media standpoint, I'm most active on Instagram, which is just at @ZachBitter.
Awesome. And your podcast looks amazing. Like I said, I started going through it, and I already checked a couple that I can't wait to dive in and listen to deeper. So this was great.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and your audience may be interested. I'm going to be recording a podcast with Dr. Dominic Agostino in a couple of weeks. So it's Human Performance Outliers podcast if folks are interested in checking out any of those episodes.
Awesome. I would love to hear that interview, and we'll share it to everybody when it comes out. So that's awesome. That's good to know. So
cool. Thank you so much.
Zach. Have a beautiful day.
Take care.